In recognition of the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War, we have a distinguished Vietnam veteran with us today as our guest speaker. Mr. David Riva was born in Chicago in 1946, attended school there. He's a longtime property owner in Fish Creek. In his civilian career, he was a vice president and president of transportation companies in the Chicago area. And I want to touch on his military career because I know that's important to him and that's why he's sitting here today. In 1966, he was drafted into the U.S. Army and assigned to the 9th Infantry Division at Fort Riley, Kansas, where he received his basic and advanced training with the 1st of the 84th Artillery. His unit arrived in Vietnam on February 3rd of 1967, and his tour of duty lasted a little over a year when he was reassigned to the 2nd Armored Division, Fort Hood, Texas, where he finished his tour of duty in May of 1968. Mr. Riva.
I'm glad he didn't say everything that I wrote about myself. First of all, to all the Vietnam veterans that are here today, welcome home. Today I will be talking to you about my patriotic beliefs, about the merits of my country and my military service. My patriotism, I started to wonder, where does it begin in a person's life? Is it something that is inherited from our parents, or does one develop it through life activities and occurrences that make us aware of what our country is to our freedoms and how we love those freedoms? For many children, it began with the attack on the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. America had been attacked by a foreign enemy on our own soil, and our country felt vulnerable to that attack anywhere in the United States. We all felt that our way of life was being attacked and our freedoms being challenged. Our world would never be the same. The way Americans responded to the attack created a sense of patriotism throughout the country that has never been seen since December 7th, 1941. Then President Roosevelt announced on that day that this is a day will live in infamy. But in a sense, on December 7th, 1941, it is where it all began for me. But not I was even born yet. You see, my father was in World War II in the Navy and drove a landing craft, an LCI, which is a landing craft infantry. These were the vehicles that landed on the beach during invasions. If any of you have seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, and those of you who haven't, in the first 10 minutes, the movie shows terrible destruction of human life that takes place in these battles. My dad used to tell me about the stories of such landings and the carnage that took place, the vicious way men died, even reaching before the beach. It made an impression on my mind that I never forgot. This is when it all started to come to me, and I realized the importance of living in America. I remember that I used to get dressed up in my dad's Navy uniform and play war games in our basement against invisible enemies when I was just 6 years old, always surviving, sometimes getting wounded, but always winning. As I got older, I found other kids in the neighborhood with the same feelings that their dads had given them and their show of patriotism. So my war moved from the basement to the outdoors. We all had our Red Ryder BB guns, and war was developed into games that could physically hurt each other. I developed the ideology that America was strong and powerful, able to take care of itself in a big, bad world. Little did I realize that my patriotism was growing and developing in me, and how it would affect me in later life. I was born in November 1946 and tried to take on the new world as my parents saw it. Thousands upon thousands of men were coming home from the war to a country that would provide them with the freedoms they fought and died for. Freedoms that would give them the right to worship as they see pleased, speak out on issues that they did not like, work where they wanted to, and play hard. They wanted to start new families, buy homes, and begin the American dream. They wanted to create all the things that we were in jeopardy of losing if Japan and Germany had won the war. To all the brave men and women who fought and died for our freedoms over the years, we could enjoy what liberties we have. Today we say thank you. So there I was, this little kid, 5 years old, growing up in a Polish neighborhood on the southwest side of Chicago. And then, wow, it happened. My parents announced to me culture shock. My parents decided to move to a suburb 25 miles west of Chicago, a town called Downers Grove. And I've got to tell you that Downers Grove reminds me so much of Sturgeon Bay that I do have my house for sale in Fish Creek, and I have a contract down on Utopia to move to Sturgeon Bay. Just a little sidebar. I go to St. Joe's Catholic Church because in Downers Grove, I went to St. Joe's Catholic Church. My main street in Downers Grove mirrors 3rd Street like a book. The neighborhood we moved to had no sidewalks, no street lights, no curbs, and no pavements. It was great. The neighborhood had tons of kids would soon become my daily soldiers, playing our war games, building our forts of wood in the summer and our snow forts in the winter. The world was great as I was living the dream that my dad had hoped for after the war. My patriotism flourished in this small suburban town, which again was just under 10,000. Downers Grove, like many small towns, had patriotic celebrations all the time. It seemed like my town was possessed and obsessed by them. Red, white, and blue flags flew all the time up and down Main Street. Once a month there was a parade with soldiers marching from World War I, World War II, and at that time, the Korean War. And you stood up when the American flag walked by, with people placing their hands on their hearts and veterans saluting. The town had a tremendous respect for the flag and what it stood for, and for veterans and what they had given. This was and is the greatest country on earth as I saw it. After grade school, my parents decided to send me to an all-boys Catholic school. Little did I know that 5 years later, the experiences that I encountered with my new band of brothers had an impact on me when I was first drafted into the U.S. Army and sent off to war. The bonds that I built with those guys and the trust given back and forth among new friends from all over the suburb, from the city of Chicago, and borders from out of state enabled me to handle what was to become of me in Vietnam. The war in Vietnam had not escalated yet, and I had become aware of what was going on and how many troops were there. At this fall time of 1964, there was about 60,000 troops on the ground in some capacity. I was a freshman in college up at Winona State, but within 8 months I had received my notice that I was to take a physical induction into the armed forces. Okay, relate to me, you guys. After a whole day of poking, prying, bending, stretching, blood tests, the works, I was classified as 1A, physically fit for military duty. The doctors reviewed my medical records and said Uncle Sam would be able to use you in the armed forces of the United States. The whole time I never questioned going into the military. In fact, I looked forward to it. It was my duty, as my dad told me. Playing war was my duty, and now I should be able to do my military service. Well, reality set in real quick. I went from being a naive young man who thought that things would run perfect in this great American society I lived in, and all things that would take care of themselves, to fast imagining the realities of an unknown war that I might have to go and fight in. My belief in patriotism, my affection for my country, and my willingness to sacrifice everything to promote my country's good was being questioned. Would I be able to do this? Could I survive basic training, a rigorous activity that my dad explained to me was the most demanding 3 months that you'll ever put your body through? I reported to the Wheaton train station, another suburb of Chicago, and again, with this innocent thoughts, I was met the reality that was to become. Here was 200 more young men who were also being inducted into the service like I was. I felt like a stone being thrown into the ocean, lost. How was I going to survive this? Questions ran through my mind, making me feel very unsecure of myself. Then when we arrived at the induction station downtown Chicago, which was a big office building, here were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other men, all walking around in t-shirts and white shorts.
and I was feeling pretty much like everyone else, like a deer in the headlights. But I quickly learned I was better prepared to handle this situation than many others. Those social skills that I learned in that all-boys school that I developed there enabled me to deal with the regiment and rigors of military life. I was assigned to the 9th Infantry Division, about 12,000 soldiers at Fort Riley, Kansas. We were told that we would replace the Big Red 1, the 1st Infantry Division that was already in Vietnam. I was fast becoming proud that I had become a soldier and become a member of a unit of men that would fast become my band of brothers. Of all the military assignments in Vietnam, perhaps none was more challenging than the defense of the Mekong Delta region, which is the area that was south of Saigon. The role of the 9th Infantry Division was to operate in that area against the Viet Cong controlled that was charging with the protection of the area and its population against communist insurgents and ensuring the success of South Vietnamese government pacification program. The 9th was faced with unrelenting physical handicaps, a tenacious enemy, and the region's rugged terrain to accomplish these goals. The men that I had done my training with were now my closest friends. It did not matter to me who he was, where he was from, his nationality, the color of his skin, or his religion. If he was in the military with me, we were connected as family, having gone through the same training and gotten to the same point in our lives, going to war. I did my training from May 1966 to December 1966 at Fort Riley, Kansas. I was assigned to the 1st of the 84th Artillery, D Battery, and I trained on an 8-inch self-propelled howitzer. This was an artillery piece that was as big as a tank, but had no armament, which means we stood on the track and fired this weapon without any protection around us. It could launch a 207-pound projectile 13 miles and hit this room every single time. It was the most accurate weapon that the Army had at that time. And at a killing radius of 80 meters, which is about the size of a football field, the percussion of the round going off would actually blow your brains out. So the enemy wanted to take us out many times. That meant also the weapon that I was on had nuclear capabilities. We always laughed about this. That meant we were expendable. You can imagine firing a nuclear weapon only 13 miles away. There were 4 guns to a battery, 12 men to a crew to fire the gun, and about 70 men to support that. All in all, we had about 110 to 120 men working as a complete team to complete our mission we were assigned to perform on a daily basis. This was my family, and we were there to kill the enemy. As Scott said, I arrived in Vietnam on February 1st, 1967, to a temperature of 105 degrees. I was now going to live in this country for a year with hopes of going home. My unit was stationed at a division-based camp with a square mile radius of about 2 miles, housing about 10,000 to 12,000 men. We stayed there for about 2 weeks to get our gear up running and our weapons ready. We moved out to our first fire base to engage the enemy and fire support for troops in our coverage of operation. The reality of what was to come had arrived. I lived in a hole in the ground for the rest of my tour of duty with another soldier. It was 4 feet deep, 6 feet long, or 8 feet long, and 6 feet wide, with a big tarp over it. I soon settled into playing my war games for real. War, as many of you guys know, is about 90% filling sandbags, maintenance and equipment, and KP duty. The other 10% is just pure hell. Not knowing where the enemy was and when he was going to fire upon us, how fast we could fire our guns back at them. If I were to write completely about the realities of war, we could be here for days. But I'll share just a few of them with you. I hadn't been there long when I got the name of Mr. Lucky. On this gun that I fired, it was my job to work a pneumatic loader that lifted this 200-pound projectile that had a fuse on the end of it, hit another arm that a chain came up and rammed it up into this big tube, which would then fire this 200-pound projectile downrange. Well, on one fire mission, I hit the loader rammer, the chain buckled, and the fuse and the round went right into the back of the tube, which is about this big. When demolition came to pick up the round, they said it was a miracle that you guys were alive. It wasn't long after that I was on guard duty. We were being attacked, and an enemy grenade was thrown into my bunker with 2 other men. Luckily, it didn't explode. On another mission, I got stuck landing on some fire ants. Poisonous, and since we were with an infantry battalion, I was lucky enough to get medical attention and the anti-venom to be able to survive that. Next, I was actually sitting on a john, which is a little portable box over a hole, when the first mortar round came in and exploded 5 feet next to me. I swallowed my chewing tobacco, but wasn't wounded. So Mr. Lucky hung in there. On another mission, going through the jungle with 15 armored vehicles in a truck, 2 men were killed by snipers right in the truck right in front of me. I kept being called Mr. Lucky, and more men were hanging around me. As the war progressed and we got later into the year, you guys know that in January of 1968, the Tet Offensive started. Well, the months October, November, December, leading up to those months, we were getting attacked almost every other night. Another bunker I was in, we were sitting in, having a beer after one attack, and the gentleman that I was in the hole with, or bunker with, Steve Bossert from North Dakota, said to me, "Dave, you better get out of this hole. That next round's going to blow up this bunker." Sure enough, as we just stepped out, the next mortar round came up and blew up the hole. My war really changed for me. When Scott was talking about the people that we lost, a young man that I had made friends with, he was 19 years old, John Mercurio from Syracuse, New York, had married his high school sweetheart and was in country for just 4 months. We had an earlier attack that lasted about 20 minutes. It calmed down. John came over to our hole in the ground, was looking for some beer. I said, "John, we don't have any, I've got to get up. I got 5 o'clock duty tomorrow. Why don't you leave?" Well, he stayed for about 45 minutes, and I finally kicked him out of our hole. John left, and within 15 seconds of returning to his hole, the first mortar round killed him. I lived with that grave burden on me for almost 40-some years before I finally went to the VA and received psychiatric treatment for that incident. And as I said, the Tet Offensive started, attacks were happening regularly. My orders came down to leave. I had gotten back to Saigon, to an area called the Tonsanut Air Base, and was able to stay there for 3 more days because they kept blowing up the airstrip. The Vietnam War had really taken off with the Tet Offensive, and those soldiers who were there at that time can attest to that. Well, I came home from war with protests suppressing, I came home to war that suppressed my service and my patriotism. Waiting to fly back to Chicago from San Francisco, I had people coming up to me calling me a baby killer while I was dressed in my dress greens. I hid in the bathroom of the washroom till my flight was called. When I arrived home in Chicago, I had great support from my family waiting for me at the airport. Aunts, uncles, cousins, friends, and of course, Mom and Dad. But it was not all real, because just 3 days earlier, I was being shot at, still trying to survive, and now I was home and I could not cope. I spent 2 nights at home, slept on the floor, couldn't handle it, told my mom I had to leave, and I went to see a buddy of mine who had already been discharged in Iowa. Life was not the same. I was crude, rude, and every other word began with F. But I had 3 months to serve, and I was stationed at Fort Hood, Texas, when Martin Luther King was shot in April, and the country went into turmoil. When I was discharged in May of 1966, I had 3 days to get home because my brother was being ordained a Catholic priest. Culture shock, wearing a suit and trying not to say the F word every 2 minutes. Nobody wanted to hear about the war, and I was not talking about it. 4th of July scared the hell out of me when there was no place to hide. In the town of Downers Grove, I regret to say, my American Legion post did not let Vietnam veterans in. They said we lost the war. I watched the 1968 Democratic Convention, riots, hearing people cheer when police beat up demonstrators. I could not make sense out of what America had become. My country did not love me for doing what duty I did, and I did not know where my patriotism lived. Like most soldiers, I was afraid to go to the VA and be named a psycho. PTSD was not diagnosed till the mid-'80s. I lived with the John Mercurio death on my consequence. I was seeing demons, fearing death was going to get me after I came home. 3 marriage fails, and I was the common denominator. but what I had was constant support from my parents and family to survive another day. It took me 10 years and 4 colleges to finally graduate from school. I was having a hard time finding a career with long months of depression controlling me. Anger, drinking, depression over and over was my constant companion. I finally went to the VA. They cleaned up their act. No longer was it like the conditions you might have seen in the movie Born on the 4th of July with Tom Cruise. Now they were showing the movie Forrest Gump. By the way, he was in the 9th Infantry Division in that movie. Apocalypse Now. They were soldiers. Were movies about Vietnam. Young kids, as I did some substitute teaching, were asking me about the war. They wanted to know what it was like. Things that I could never talk about for 20 years. But I still had my problems. As I said, about 7 years ago, I had counseling at the VA to talk about the demons and how to get rid of them. He said I was not to blame for John's death. I was able to join the American Legion in the town that I had just left in Elmhurst, Illinois. That's post 187, where I'm still a member. And I found a new band of brothers there. As I look through the crowd and see you guys in uniform and your hats on, I treat you the same way. We all had a common ground, common problems to share. Life changed, and I realized it was not my fault. My military service taught me teamwork. The uniform gave me pride in our country. Service in combat gave me the ability to overcome fear. Arriving home to a family who loved me and worried for my safe return increased my family's values. I became very successful in life, even though I fought all these demons. I was the president of 2 firms. I served on board of directors, successfully coached baseball and soccer teams, chaired St. Jude golf outings for 10 years. But it took many years to get over what I saw and what I did. Today, I'm living a dream in Door County in a log cabin on a street with no curbs, no sidewalks, and no streetlights. In my mind, I'm back home in Downers Grove and lucky to be living the dream in a land I fought for and saw men and women die who served this country. I realize that what makes this country strong and great and a great place to live is not about the country we fight in, or the hill we take, or the town we fight for, but about the men and women who gave the ultimate sacrifice and those veterans who served beside them. I could not be more proud to say I am an American citizen and a veteran of this great country. My patriotism is as strong as ever. Thank you all, and God bless America.